Psychosis is a break from reality, meaning that when a person loses their concept of reality, they experience things that aren't real. So, with hallucinations and delusions essentially shaping a person's existence into a false reality, is there actually anything real about psychosis? Yeah, absolutely. Even though a person's experience in psychosis isn't really happening to anyone around them, it is happening to them as if it is actually 100% true. So a person's reactions to the things they're seeing and hearing, or the trauma that's inflicted upon them by the scary things that happen in those delusions and hallucinations, the emotional responses they have, the emotions that they are taking away with from that experience, those are all real. For example, I was greatly affected by something that did not happen that I experienced to be real, and that was the loss of my grandpa. In one of my hospitalizations during one of my worst episodes, I had a phone call with my grandpa, and after he hung up the phone and said goodbye, something in me told me that that was the final goodbye. With no proof or evidence that my grandpa died, I wholeheartedly believed that he had died, and that grief hit me. I absolutely grieved the loss of a man who was very much still alive, but nonetheless, I felt that entirely as if it really did happen. When he did ultimately die, there was a part of me that had already grieved that, and so it was actually not as hard to grieve as I'd expected it to be. I had already had the initial shock. I had already had the initial feelings associated with finding out your favorite person died and grieving them. So I kind of had already processed a lot of that. It had a lasting effect. It absolutely shaped my relationship with my grandpa. I appreciated him a lot more after that. And so while he was still alive and I got to continue having a relationship with him, which I was so much more grateful for afterwards, I have grieved a person who was still alive. I often tell people to validate the feelings and not the symptoms, because while the symptoms may not be real, the emotional responses that people in psychosis have, those are 100% real. What we experience is so real to us that any emotional response, any reaction, any trauma taken from that is real. Roaming or wandering is a common symptom of psychosis. And just like it sounds, it's when a person just takes off and leaves. Essentially, it's when a person will just leave from wherever they are and they will aimlessly wander for an indefinite amount of time, either with no destination in mind, or if they have a destination in mind, they will take strange, wayward routes to get there. I myself was a wanderer, and this was a pretty major symptom for me because it can be rather dangerous to go off wandering on your own, especially when you're in a vulnerable state like a person is in psychosis. And sometimes I did have a destination in mind, sometimes I didn't. I do remember that when I had a destination in mind, I wasn't following typical directions. I wasn't following a map. I wasn't following road signs and traffic lights to know where I was getting. I was following sounds, and I was following colors. I was following different types of car because the way I was getting there was more intuitive. It was more of a, I'll know when I get there. Like, even if I had a destination, like a house specifically in mind, I would know when I'd get there. Or if I had an idea of where I was going, like I'm going to find my new family in a castle, I wouldn't know what that would look like, but I'd know when I'd get there. I typically start wandering around dusk, so when the sun would start to set would be when that mechanism would turn on in me that would say you need to get up and go, and it felt like this very urgent need to go find whatever was calling me. I remember that I sometimes would even just throw on really strange clothes because I needed my protection. Like one time I had like an extension cord and I wrapped it up and wore it like a harness because that would protect me from the denizens in the mountains, things like that. So I would be out in public looking really, really strange and just kind of like making strange turns and twisting and kind of just going in a really haphazard way. And that was how I would get around. All of these twists and turns would amount to miles and miles and miles and miles of walking, because I would walk until something stopped me. Even if I had a destination in mind, I never found it. I don't think I ever would have found it, because I would just take off and that would be it. It would never stop. So I think the longest mileage for me was the time I walked from about 7 p.m. to 11 a.m. the next day. And I did the math, that is over 40 miles of walking in one go. Thankfully, I'm a backpacker, so I'm used to walking up to like 18 miles a day as it is. It's not hard for me. I did, however, do that barefoot, and I had a lot of blisters. The only thing that could stop me was the cops. And I'm pretty sure that every single time I wandered, I ended up getting picked up by the cops, because I would have just kept going. And, you know, that was always very strange, because when you break a delusion, you kind of just go into a different delusion. So here I'd be going from searching for my family in a castle to suddenly being taken to a spaceship by aliens. Like, that's what I thought was going on when the police would pick me up. And that's absolutely not what was going on. But, you know, you're a very confused person when you're in that state. And so I never really know what's happening when I'm like that. Anyway, that's my experience with wandering. And if you, like me, are a wanderer and you can relate, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about your experience. In my video about psychotic wandering, and if you don't know, psychotic wandering is just when a person with psychosis takes off and wanders aimlessly with no destination in mind. I talked about how every time I wandered, I got picked up by the cops. Someone asked me a very specific question about that, and it was something I could relate to, a very specific event to occur. So I will elaborate on that here and tell you about my experience being violated by the police. So the very last time that I wandered, I had a really negative experience with the police. Up until then, every time I'd picked up, it had been fairly okay, and there had never been any inappropriate behavior on their end. But the third and final time that I wandered, I was sexually violated. I really don't know if that's the right term for it, because I think it was above sexual harassment, but below sexual assault. Essentially, I was naked and I was streaking downtown in my town because I believed that I was being spied on and chased by these spies, and that I would be invisible if I were naked. Kind of like the Emperor's New Clothes, where I was already invisible, but the clothes were what gave me away. So in desperation, sheer desperation to get away from these spies, I stripped out of my clothes and I went streaking. Not far down the road, a cop car pulled up, and these two police officers came out and they put me in the back of the car buck-ass naked. And I know that they knew me because less than a week before that, I had already been picked up for wandering. So they were familiar that I was a psychotic woman who was vulnerable and very, very naked, and they did not give me a blanket. They didn't give me anything to cover myself. They just threw me in the back of the car naked. I don't know if it's normal to not give a blanket to a naked person in a squad car, but I do know that the next thing that happened was definitely not normal. They called ahead to the police department and they let them know that they had this naked woman and that they would be arriving soon, and they told everyone to go outside and wait for me. So when I got to the police department, I was met by the entire department who had lined up outside the building, and I got out of the car naked and they paraded me in front of all of these men, every single person in the building, And when I finally got to the door, there was a single woman who threw a blanket over my shoulders and said, "I'm so sorry for this." I had no idea what she meant by that, because at the time I was in so much distress, thinking that I had been spied on and that now these men were putting me in a spaceship and they were going to take me to outer space to their planet, and that they were aliens, you know. In that mindset, I was not at all concerned that I was naked, because I was in a state of emergency and I was in too much distress to prioritize my nakedness over how absolutely terrified I was by my delusions. So once I was in a cell, they gave me some clothes, and then an ambulance came and took me to the hospital, and they tried to find a bed for me in a psych ward or a mental hospital, and nothing was available. I was ultimately sent home to stay with my mom until a bed did, you know, become available, which took some time. And I didn't understand what was going on. I did not understand what was happening to me. Like, in general, I didn't understand that I was psychotic. I didn't understand the delusions. I didn't understand that I had gone through this like sexual violation, and not that I'd been picked up by aliens, you know. It wasn't for several years that I found out what actually happened to me, because someone kind of had to spell it out for me and say, that was not okay. See, I can remember things, and I think these cops were playing on the fact that I didn't know what was going on and they could get away with it, but I remember things, and I remember events, and I remember exactly what happened to me in explicit detail. Like, that is not something you forget. So while they took advantage of my mind state, they probably didn't bank on the fact that someday I'd be okay and I'd be fully aware of what happened to me. And to be honest, I'm really not okay with it. Like, first of all, I didn't really get hit with the truth until like a couple of years ago. And mind you, this episode was like 8 years ago. And I'm still kind of processing that. And, you know, I don't know if I sound like some kind of a fucking snowflake for how traumatizing that was. But yeah, it fucking sucked, okay? And unfortunately, like, that happens. Like, police take advantage of psychotic people a lot. Like, it absolutely happens. And I'm really sorry for anyone else that that's happened to. It really sucks to be that vulnerable and then to be taken advantage of, like, at all. So my heart goes out to anyone who can relate to this story, because I really wish no one did. But the fact that there are people who do, like, it breaks my heart, and I really feel for you. And so I understand, like, at the very least, there's someone out there who understands. I completely understand what you've gone through.